A skill issue is something that arises through a lack of motor control, as opposed to a capacity issue, which is the inability of the body to produce the necessary force or mobility required to complete the task. When analysing this athlete's agility through the use of an M drill, it appears to me that there is a suspected skill issue upon deceleration. I therefore isolated the first corner of the M drill and looked at the athlete's deceleration mechanics closely. This paused image shows the athlete's first step of deceleration, and as you can see, the weight displacement has already shifted to the right of the athlete's base of support. You can also see that there is early rotation through the shoulders, torso, hips, and knees before he has finished his deceleration properly. This side-on view shows clearly that as the athlete decelerates, his heel strike is not far in front of his centre of mass, whilst also opening his right hip up before he has completed the deceleration phase, ultimately resulting in the athlete having to jump to rearrange his body to complete the turn. These issues therefore suggest strongly that it is a skill issue rather than a capacity issue. I therefore analysed this athlete's bilateral strength capacities through the use of a back squat and RDL. Here you can clearly see that the athlete has good bilateral strength capacities through his anterior and posterior chain, whilst also demonstrating good mobility, suggesting that this is not an issue either. We then tested the athlete unilaterally, and again there were no issues here. The athlete then demonstrated good mobility through the use of a squat hold, suggesting this wasn't an issue either. I then decided to test this athlete's mobility through the use of a split squat hold and Spider-Mans, and again there were no capacity issues with his mobility to suggest that it would impact on acceleration biomechanics. Now that we know the athlete has good strength and mobility capacities, we can focus on developing their motor control. To correct this skill issue, we started with a single cone deceleration drill, where the athlete was focusing on decelerating the body as quickly as possible by maintaining technical efficiency. This paused image of the first step of deceleration shows how the athlete is trying to maintain alignment through the ankle, knee and hip to ensure efficiency when trying to decelerate his mass. You can see this enhanced position from side on as his feet remain in front of his centre of mass, with his hips behind them and his head and shoulders forward, allowing for re-acceleration. Once this athlete was able to maintain this motor control, we then progressed onto a double deceleration and then a triple deceleration, ensuring that the athlete maintained these good qualities where his feet were in front of his centre of mass, his knees, ankles and hips were in line, and he finished his deceleration. As the athlete's deceleration improved from this protocol, we can conclude that it was in fact a skill issue and not a capacity issue. Watching this athlete perform the M drill, it looks to me as though he has reasonably good motor control, and the obvious thing is how long it takes for him to decelerate on each corner. Consequently, I decided to look closely at his deceleration on the first corner of the M drill, and as you can see, his biomechanics are reasonably good. However, he decides to decelerate 3 meters away from the cone. I then decided to test the athlete's mobility through the use of a squat hold, a bench squat, and a dynamic movement representing running. Although the athlete's mobility isn't of an exceptional standard, there is nothing seen here to suggest that it would impact upon his deceleration biomechanics. The athlete's strength capacities were definitely under par, with him only being able to leg press 100 kilos when weighing in at 95. You can also see here at the bottom of his Nordic curl, he is unable to maintain a good position and flexes at the hip. As the athlete had underdeveloped strength capacities in his posterior and anterior chain, I decided to improve this through the use of a back squat, split squat and an RDL. Here you can see the athlete is now squatting 110 kilos for 4 reps as opposed to just 100 kilos on the leg press. Through the use of an RDL due to a dynamic correspondence, we increased his posterior chain strength, as you can see here, with the athlete now RDLing 80 kilos. With the athlete's improved strength capacities, I then returned to a double deceleration drill, where there was a time constraint on how long the athlete could take to decelerate. Although this is at a reduced speed due to the constraints, the athlete is now able to decelerate his mass in just 3 steps instead of 5 or 6. When returning to the M drill, you can now clearly see how the athlete is decelerating quicker, and as a byproduct of being stronger, he is also accelerating quicker. As I focus on this first corner of the M drill, it becomes even clearer, and it enables me to conclude that it was therefore a capacity issue for a lack of strength. When analysing this athlete's falling acceleration, it looks to me as though there is a capacity issue. As you can see here, the athlete has limited knee drive and a poor shin angle, whilst also flexing through the spine, causing a C shape. I then tested this athlete's mobility, and as you can see here during a Spider-Man, he struggles to get his foot up towards his hand. I then moved on to a split squat hold, where again you can see that he looks particularly tight through his hip flexors and quads, as his torso is flexing forward as he lowers into the split squat hold. Finally, I tested this athlete on a rack held squat, and as you can see that the lack of mobility around the hips is an issue that could potentially be affecting the athlete's biomechanics when accelerating. Finally, I tested the athlete's strength capacities through the use of a bilateral squat and an RDL, and as you can see from both videos, the strength capacities of his posterior chain and anterior chain are not an issue, with him back squatting 110 and RDLing 100 kilos. I then put in place 3 corrective measures, starting with foam rolling, static stretching and dynamic mobility. Here you can see the athlete has improved his squat range through the use of holding a rack to enable himself to sit back and get lower. He also continued with his mobility through the use of Spider-Mans to build the range around his hip flexors, and then finally the use of split squats to again build this range and slowly get deeper into this position. Now that the athlete's mobility has improved, I wanted him to get used to using it in a dynamic way. I started with barbell step up with a hip lock to enable the athlete to focus on driving one leg up whilst fully extending at the other. I then progressed on to wall drives, where the athlete performed singles, then doubles, and finally triples, allowing him to experience this extra range that he is not used to. You can see clearly in the images here the athlete is now in a much better position, all through extra range at the hips. Lastly, I used banded accelerations for the athlete to focus on this knee drive in these extended positions, but in a more horizontal stance that was more dynamically corresponding to acceleration. These 3 exercises ultimately ensure that the extra mobility that this athlete has is now used in the acceleration phase. As you can see, when returning to a falling acceleration, the athlete is in a far better position. He has a much higher leg drive with an improved shin angle and no flexion through the spine, meaning that the protocol worked and it was in fact a capacity issue. Here we have an athlete performing falling accelerations where I believe there to be a skill issue. From this paused image you can see that the athlete does not achieve triple extension with his back leg. His front leg has a poor shin angle, there's a lack of aggression with his arm swing, and he flexes through the thoracic spine, almost causing a reverse S shape. From this rear view you can also see the exaggerated lateral movement and torso rotation. I then decided to test this athlete's mobility through the use of a split squat hold and Spider-Mans, and again there were no capacity issues with his mobility to suggest that it would impact on acceleration biomechanics. Again, when testing this athlete's mobility in positions that are specific to acceleration mechanics, there seems to be no issues present. We'll then assess the athlete's strength capacities, and as you can see here, the athlete is demonstrating good strength capacities with a bilateral squat, and then again with a unilateral squat, and finally demonstrating good posterior chain strength with a good RDL. Finally, I looked at the athlete's dynamic strength through the use of a heavy prowler push, and as you can see, the athlete demonstrated good capacities once again, ultimately confirming what we believe to be a skill issue and not a capacity issue. I then selected 3 exercises to correct this skill issue, such as wall drives, banded accelerations and the prowler push. Wall drives develop the athlete's ability to achieve triple extension with an aggressive shin angle, and as the athlete developed this skill and motor control, we moved from singles to doubles and then finally to triple knee drives. The next progression was banded accelerations, where the band causes the athlete to have a high knee drive with an aggressive shin angle to achieve full triple extension. Prowler push was then used to further develop the technical aspects of an aggressive shin angle and triple extension, but in a more specific stance related to acceleration. As the athlete continued to develop technical proficiency, we enhanced the speed at which he performed the Prowler push to ensure dynamic correspondence to the acceleration. When returning to the corrected falling acceleration, you can now see that the athlete does not flex through the spine, he achieves full triple extension and has a far more aggressive shin angle as well as arm swing. You can also see from this rear angle that that there is far less lateral movement and torso rotation occurring, ultimately confirming that it was in fact a skill issue.